Lisa and Duncan and come back. Thank you. You came back. So yeah, this is the one where the rubber hits the road. So been through those and looking forward to hearing your presentation and going from there. Thank you. The floor is yours.
So thank you, everyone. Yeah, just again introducing Duncan from last week, and now this is going to be the exciting one. We get to see a bit of the actual data for our district. So just pass over to Duncan, and we do have Lisa possibly online if we need her.
So, kia ora everyone. Good to be back and to have the chance to present some of the work that we've been doing to you and have a chance to talk through. The presentation we're going to aim to sort of take about 40 minutes, and the idea is I'll kind of go through the presentation and then we should have some time at the end for questions. So to ensure that we get through the presentation and we get through all the information that's in there, if you can hold your questions to the end, unless there's something that's really unclear that I'm kind of talking through, that would be great. Cool, thank you. So the presentation has just disappeared from the screen.
We've actually got it. I mean, do we need to? Or did you want to speak to it up on the screen?
That would be because there's a lot of charts and
there is.
And
that's true.
So,
that is true. Thank you.
Be sort of explaining the charts.
Yeah.
It was there a second ago. Well, while we're trying to get the presentation back, I'll just quickly kind of go over what we're planning to cover for the day. So what I'll do is the aim of the session is to sort of talk through the outcomes of the modelling work that we've done. Before I do that, what I'll do, I'll just go over very briefly the scenarios that we looked at, what we were actually modelling, so we sort of understand the different things that are kind of being looked at, the different options that we've got, and I'll briefly also talk about what the modelling does and doesn't do. So it's not the precise answer, and so there's some caveats around some of the information we'll be presenting. So it's important to understand the limitations of the modelling exercise, and then I'll go through. Then I'll spend the bulk of the time going through the results themselves. I do, but what's strange that was there a second ago. Yeah,
I've all got it on their computers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
We all have
it. Okay.
You're just probably describing.
If you've all got it on your computers,
that's what I was saying. Yeah.
Cool.
I have it on my computer too, luckily. All right, so if you want to move to, I believe it is slide 3 in the presentation. If we do get it back up, then we can move to that one, but we'll carry on with this. So just to recap, so what we did is we in order to cover off the complexities that are involved in all the different types of elements that make up a collection system, we developed a bunch of scenarios. So there was 4 scenarios that we looked at, and those were, we characterized those as a low cost scenario, what we're calling kind of an all-round scenario, a max carbon reduction scenario, and a high diversion scenario. So those are the scenarios that we looked at, and we went away and we've modeled up what those might look like. In all of the scenarios, the food waste collections are being provided only to 14,350 urban households. That's our assumption in terms of who's getting that service. And all of these scenarios, they use specialist food waste collection vehicles. In the max carbon reduction scenario, we assume that we're using electric vehicles, and I'll come to that. So the low cost scenario, just to sort of recap what that looks like, basically each household would get a sort of 23, 25 litre curbside bin. It's got a locking lid so that if it gets knocked over by dogs or whatever, the contents won't spill out. That would be collected weekly into a specialist vehicle, and then by manual collection, and then that food waste would go to a vermicomposting facility, potentially the one in Tokoroa. Then the next scenario we've got is we termed it an all-round scenario. It's essentially the same as the low-cost scenario, but it adds a kitchen caddy, a small sort of bench top, so 8 to 10 litre kitchen caddy. So the householders can put their food waste in that and then transfer that into the curbside bin. Other than that, it's largely the same as the low-cost scenario. So then moving on to the next slide. The main difference in this scenario, this is the max carbon reduction scenario. There's a few differences in this one. The big difference is in the benchtop caddy. What it does is you substitute out the solid-sided caddy for one that's got ventilation holes in it, and that becomes lined with a compostable liner. And what that does, that allows air to sort of reach the food waste. That helps dry it out, stops it from smelling and going slimy, which is a big thing that puts off householders from using food waste collection services. And so that is shown particularly overseas, where in UK and Europe, where this is probably the most common system over there. That helps maintain participation in the service. The other big difference is that the waste would be collected in electric vehicles, which are more expensive to purchase, although they have lower running costs. And there is potentially some logistical differences, although it's not kind of quite clear how that would work in this situation. And then the other big thing is that food waste would go to an anaerobic digestion facility. And for the purposes of this exercise, we've nominated the facility which is being built in Reparoa. And so the difference with anaerobic digestion, that generates methane, which is a gas that can then be used for, in the case of the Reparoa facility, for heating glass houses next to the Turner and Grower site where they're co-located. And that's instead of, so they burn that instead of burning natural gas, which has a bunch of carbon benefits essentially. And then the final scenario that we looked at is the high diversion scenario. Same sort of caddies and liners set up, except the big difference here is we're saying they would get an extra collection each week and an extra set of liners as well. And that's what we're trying to do there, is we're trying to mimic the highest performing systems that they have in Europe, essentially. So that's a twice weekly collection. And that waste will all go to an in-vessel composting facility, such as one at Turahia or Hampton Downs. And the advantage there is those facilities can handle those compostable liners. They would actually go through that process and be able to be composted. So that's basically what we've modelled. Hopefully that's clear, but if you've got any questions on that, let me know. So just before we kind of get into the results, just really want to very quickly say what the modelling work does and doesn't do. Basically what we're doing in the modelling work is the sort of main thing we're trying to do is figure out how many trucks we need to go out and collect all that waste. That's probably the main driver of cost. There's a whole lot of things that go into that, how often people set their bins out, how much householders put into their bin each time, how long it takes to collect each bin, how far apart the households are, how long it takes the trucks to drive. So there's a whole lot of different elements to that's what the model is there to sort of to figure out. And then that we add in sort of like the container costs and the processing costs, overheads, etc., to develop the cost model. We found the model to be very accurate in terms of its ability to predict costs. We've done it dozens of times, And also we aligned the model with the, we modeled the curbside recycling collection, and we managed to get that to line up very closely in terms of the numbers of vehicles and costs of that. So that gives us some confidence that we've got the dynamics and the logistics pretty close. And also what we've done is we're involved in a number of procurement processes around the country, and so we can see what the contractors out there are actually bidding in terms of their costs, and so we can make sure that what we've said and what we're coming out with in a model sort of lines up with what the market's actually saying at the moment. And so the results I'll show you, they do line up reasonably well. There's probably a few things going on in the market at the moment that make it a little bit more uncertain. Things like inflation and fuel costs particularly driving up, and so there's probably a bit of risk priced into some of those contracts at the moment. And there's a few other little things, caveats in there as well. I won't sort of go into that now, but we might end up talking about some of those in the questions as we go through. And so then what the model doesn't do is it doesn't necessarily predict your contract costs. So there's a whole lot of things that can go into what bidders might, what contractors might choose to bid, the level of risk that you've got in the contract, the level of competition. Sorry, yep, we're on slide 6. Thanks for that. You know, what whether they want to sort of establish themselves in the market or protect the market, the contract term, the contract conditions, a whole lot of stuff that will influence what the actual price is. And we've seen when bidders bid that, you know, in any one tender for any one specification, you can get, you know, like a 50% variation in the costs that those contractors come through with. So we sort of try to aim, you know, what we think the sort of base cost will be, and then there's all those other factors on top of it. The other thing just before we start is, so the modelling we've done, you know, we're always sort of tweaking it. I have played with the numbers a little bit since this presentation was put together. We'll probably finalise those numbers. They don't change. They haven't changed much, but they will probably change by you know, 1 or 2% as we sort of refine and make sure the models well sort of adjusted. So the numbers are not finalized, but they're not going to move much from what we're going to show you. So all right, moving on to the next slide. So this is the headline figures, I guess, from the work we've done. This is the total cost per annum for urban households, and this is excluding any kind of initial startup costs that there might be. Apart from the container rollout, we've built in the rollout costs into the cost of the container. Yeah, and the trucks. Yeah, so that's all. The trucks would all be a capital cost that the contractor would take on. We've assumed in this that the cost of the containers is just spread out over the life of the contract. It might be something that council might want to buy those containers as a one-off, and that would sort of come out of the costs that we've done. There's also, as we'll talk about, the government might subsidise the cost of those containers. So we've done some sensitivity modelling, which we'll go through later on, which looks at what the impact on that might be on the cost. Just looking at the data that we've got here. The key thing there is the low cost scenario. We've got a sort of total cost around sort of 660,000 per annum. The all round scenario goes up to about 750,000, sorry. Per annum. The max carbon reduction scenario bumps up again to sort of about 1.2 million, and then the high diversion scenario, you're looking probably about 1.6 million. The breakdown of those costs. So if you look across the sort of, we've broken that out into the collection costs, the container costs, and the processing costs, and the overheads are sort of spread across each of those areas. The collection costs is the biggest chunk, sort of accounts for sort of roughly, roughly sort of 2/3 of the cost of each of those scenarios. The containers, that's something we'll sort of dive into a little bit further. We're talking about sort of, 10 to 15% maybe for containers, and then sort of 20 to 30% on the processing costs. So all those capital costs, by the way, that are sort of embedded in those numbers are sort of spread over around about 10 years. So we'll just move on to the next slide. So slide 8. So this slide here is basically the same information as what you've seen in the previous slide. It just breaks that out. What you can see there is that the main driver of cost is that collection cost, and the reason why that collection cost goes up, there's two main reasons why it goes up. One is the numbers of households that are actually assumed to be participating in the service. So if households only put their bin out, if only half the households put their bin out each week, it's going to be a lot quicker than if 3/4 of the households put their bin out each week. So that's the sort of the main driver around those logistics. Also in the high diversion scenario, we've got 2 collections per week. So they have it. So each of those collections would have a lower set out rate. So fewer households putting out each week, each collection, but overall you get a higher sort of number each week, if you like.
Duncan, Phil have a question. Yeah, just for a minute. What do you
Can we have?
Here, if it's sort of questions for clarification, yep.
So, well, yeah, just on that, the collection, what's the sort of trends in the towns about whether people put bins out or not put bins out? Because you said it could be quicker or slower, you know.
Yeah, and that's so behind this is a parameter report. We've sort of got all of our assumptions around those numbers. What we're finding at the moment with the collection services that have been rolled out, which is places like Hamilton, Auckland, and New Plymouth. The setup rates are relatively low. They're probably more like on what we've assumed for the low cost scenario, so around sort of 30 to 40% each set out. So maybe around 40 to 50% of households using the service in total, 30 to 40% putting a bin out each week, which is on the low side, and that's, in our view, that's because the level of services is relatively low compared to what you'll find in a lot of overseas countries like Europe. So we've had to sort of make some assumptions around that based on what we know. But what we do know is that the services that are here, they're still sort of fairly early days in terms of households getting used to them and all the rest of it. If you look at sorry, moving on to the next slide. So this is basically those same figures, but broken down into like a per household served cost. So the low cost scenario, we're looking around about $46 per household. The per year, yep, per year. The all round scenario around about 52. The max carbon reduction scenario around about 83 there, and about 110, 111 for the high diversion scenario. And this is so this is excluding any kind of council costs there might be in terms of communications and enforcement activity and contract management. All that kind of stuff would go on top of these numbers. And we do some of those numbers a little bit later on. I'll talk through those. So this is slide 9, by the way. So moving on to the next slide, which will be slide 10. So I mentioned that the government is potentially looking at subsidising the cost of the service, and what they've talked about publicly, whether it's a concrete commitment yet, but this is certainly what they're saying, is that the government will potentially purchase the bins for councils that want to put a food waste service in place, and they will also potentially pay for the capital cost of the electric trucks if people want to put those in place.
But not a diesel truck.
Not diesel trucks, but just electric vehicles. So we've done some initial sensitivities around what the impact of that would be. And so the blue bar on that chart there is the cost without their government subsidy.
Duncan, can I just stop there? Roger? You're muted, I
Thank
think.
you. Yeah, no,
We were hanging
thank you.
on to holding off questions until the end of the presentation, unless you want clarification.
It was clarification.
Okay,
The clarification, if the cost per household is a cost per household participating, or is it a cost for per all households?
has to be all.
Yeah. So it's a cost per household served. So if the household has access to the service, that's the cost, whether they use it or not. Yeah.
Thank you. That's the
Households,
answer I wanted. Thank you.
14,350 households.
Yep. That's the answer. Thank you.
The blue bar is the cost without any government subsidy. The orange bar there is assuming that the government would pay for the containers, and then the yellow bar there is assuming the government will pay for the containers and some electric vehicles. So the capital cost of those comes off, and the annualized cost of that sort of comes off. So that brings those sort of bring the costs down. Looking at savings around sort of $4 to $6 per household for the bins, and then up to maybe $10, $12 per household if you take off the cost of the trucks as well. So that's those two combined. So we'd sort of bring those costs down in the case of the low cost scenarios, from about sort of 43 down to sort of high 30s. In the all-round scenario, down to about $40 from 52, and the max carbon reduction scenario from around sort of 80 down to around sort of 65 or so. And for the high division scenario, from around 110 to around about 90. So we'll move on. So the next slide is just what the cost per service is. So this is each time the truck goes past the household, what's the cost of that? And it's for the low cost and the all-round scenario, it's around about $1 per service. That goes up for the carbon reduction scenario to $1.60, and that comes back down again for the high division scenario, basically because you get two collections per week on that one. So move on to the next slide, slide 12. And this is we're looking at the food waste diversion. So this is the number of tons per year that we've calculated you would be able to divert through that service, and that ranges for the low cost scenario, which is the lowest performing one, from around about 1,000 tons per annum, up to around about 2,000, but over 2,000 tons per annum for the high division scenario. And that's driven largely by the convenience of the service for the householders. That's the main sort of thing that's driving that increase in participation. There are a whole bunch of other things that can be used to drive participation, such as education and enforcement. Those will help you drive participation, but we've kind of assumed that you've got the same level for each of those scenarios. So you could potentially get better or worse levels of recovery in the system, depending on what you wrap around it in terms of communications particularly. So moving on to the next slide, which will be slide 13. So just looking at what that means in terms of what's in the waste at the moment, and what kind of impact is this having on your sort of waste division overall. If you look at the bottom bar there, so that's well, it's quite small, but that's basically what's happening at the moment. So you've got around about 300. Can't quite read that myself. Yeah, 326 tons per annum of was about 500 kilos per annum per household of rubbish, of which about 187 is food waste, and the rest is other rubbish. And then you've got 195 kilos per annum, per household that's recycling. So basically what that sort of gives you an idea. That blue part of the bar at the bottom there is the potential to that you could divert, and then each of the scenarios on top of that is the amount that we're assuming is diverted through each of the scenarios. So in the low cost scenario, we divert about 70 kilos of that 187 per household. In the all round scenario, we look to divert roughly half. And that's fairly sort of typical of what you're getting at the moment. And then the max carbon reduction, that goes up again to sort of around about 120 kilos, and then up to close to 150 kilos by the time you get to the high diversion scenario, which that's getting up to around about the sort of the maximum performance that you get in the best performing systems internationally.
So I'll just say, of course, that blue bar is what's possible, but we just know that through what's happening in other places, not everyone's going to use it 100% of the time, 100% perfectly. So we've just modeled the more realistic scenarios per service.
Yeah. It'd be great if everyone put all of their food waste in the bin, but they don't.
Yeah.
So
It's probably one of my major concerns is we've got enough difficulties with the contamination in our yellow bins now.
Yep.
And then another one that's just oh gosh, it really worries me, honestly.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that after, actually,
Okay.
because that is that's definitely something to discuss. That last slide, that hopefully gives you a little bit of a feel for how much of impact on what's in the bins can we actually make through this service. And it's not quite as much as you'll get from the recycling, but it's a good chunk, and it's the biggest chunk of what's left in the bins, basically. So the next slide, which is slide 14, is that sort of looks at what's that cost on it, what's that diversion look like on a cost per ton basis. And it's just a way of sort of getting an idea of what's the relative cost. So to give some orientation to this, your current recycling collection costs around $475 per tonne. And if a householder is using something like a 120 litre wheelie bin that's getting collected weekly, that will be costing them around about $1,000 a tonne to get that collected. So, so the food waste collection, it would be less than what householders are paying for their rubbish collection at the moment, but a little bit more than the recycling service. And they're all those numbers there. The highest one is the high diversion scenario, and that's because you're getting that sort of gold-plated twice weekly kind of service. The lowest one is the all-round service, and that's mainly because you're getting a reasonable uplift in performance with not much extra cost. The main cost being around the extra cost of the bin and a little bit more participation. So we'll move on to the next slide, which is slide 15, and we're looking at the carbon reduction side of things. So one of the things we were asked to do is what's the impact, the carbon impact potentially of introducing this service, and one of the reasons that the ministry is looking to subsidise these types of collections is because they're wanting to get organic waste out of landfill, because that's the biggest contributor to carbon emissions from the waste sector. So what we've done is we've looked at what's the sort of the pros and cons in terms of what the impact on carbon will be, and that impact comes a number of ways. The biggest way is through avoided landfill emissions. So landfills are, as Lisa was talking about last week, they give off methane, which is a greenhouse gas 28 times more potent than CO2. And so we can avoid some of those emissions, and that's the biggest sort of chunk potentially of emissions that you can avoid. But then there will be some added emissions from running some extra trucks around to get to collect the waste and then to transport that waste to the processing facilities. And then also you'll also lose at the moment the landfills, they capture some of the gas that's generated from the organic waste that goes in there, and they use that to generate electricity. So you'll lose that electricity generation as well. And the next chart, a couple of charts will sort of show that. But then also, if you're doing something like sending it to an anaerobic digestion plant, then you'll get some extra carbon benefits from avoiding fossil fuels and that type of process. And then the last thing that we'll get carbon benefit is from using those outputs to improve soil. So you can sequester some of the carbon that's in the compost back into the soil, and some of that will stay there. And also you can avoid fossil fuel based fertilizer inputs into the soil, so superphosphate. You can reduce those inputs, and that will also have a carbon benefit. So that's what we've taken into account in our calculations. And if you look at so the next slide, which is slide 16, you look at the relative quantities there, and what you'll see from that is that the max carbon reduction scenario looks a whole lot better than the others. The others do have some carbon benefits around between 1 and sort of 300 tons, depending on the scenarios. But the max carbon benefit scenario obviously a lot, at least twice as good as the next one in terms of the amount of carbon benefit that you're getting. And I'll just move on to the next slide, which is slide 17, and sort of show you how that's made up. So the main benefit I mentioned was the reduction in greenhouse gas coming out of landfills, and that's the orange part of the bar there. And the transport emissions so that's the yellow part of the bar. My mistake. The transport emissions is the orange part of the bar, which is a fairly small amount, and that's actual emissions that you're adding, and so that sits above the line, and then also the loss of electricity generation from the landfill gas, that's in the little blue bit that's above the line, and you lose that as well. So that sort of comes off the net emissions. And then you can see there's a large sort of blue chunk in the carbon reduction scenario, and that's substituting the emissions, the gas from the AD for the fossil fuels and heating the greenhouse, basically. That's the level of carbon emissions that you get from there. And that's why that scenario looks so much better essentially than the others. And then the green bar is what the benefit's going to be from avoiding from using that output as a soil to improve soil, basically. Now, one of the things, this is starting to get a little bit technical, but it's worth mentioning. So one of the things, one of the assumptions we made is that around the amount of gas that will be captured at landfill, and that is, there's some debate in the waste community around what that number should actually be. So there's an official number, which is what the landfills like Turahia and Hampton Downs claim under the emissions trading scheme, and that number is around about, I think for Turahia it's 90%, for Hampton Downs it's 89%. They claim that that's how much they're capturing, and that's based on they base that on sort of current what's called current gas capture. So that's essentially, they calculate how much of all the waste that's going in, how much gas they think that will produce, and then they see how much of that they're capturing, and that's what they capture minus what they think they're going to produce, and that's how they get to the 89 or 90% sort of number. There's another number which can be calculated, which is basically the lifetime emissions from the landfill, and that includes the emissions that happen before they start sucking the gas out and capturing it, and after they close the landfill and stop sucking the gas out and capturing it. And so that number is lower, basically. And we don't know what that number is for the particular landfills around here, but we do know from work done internationally, sort of roughly what that number is, and it's around about sort of 65%. We've used a figure here of 68%, which is what the Climate Change Commission has used as their sort of default figure for landfill gas emissions for New Zealand. And so if we plug that 68% figure in, that's then avoiding sending that food waste to landfill looks a whole lot better in terms of what emissions that you're going to avoid in the landfill. And that's what, so the yellow bar there, if you flick sort of between the two slides, between 17 and 18, you can see the impact that assumption makes on the assumed level of benefit from the service. So we don't know exactly what that number is, but we can see that there's a key sort of assumption there, which can make quite a big difference to what we're seeing. For what it's worth, our view is that the lifetime gas capture figure is the more sensible figure to use, but the other one is kind of the official figure. So we've sort of gone conservative and used that in the first instance.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
Just with regard to the orange, the total transport emissions, is that just from the source to the transport station, or does it also include after it gets dealt with there and then to the next?
Yes, includes the bulking and so there's the collection and then onward transport. And all those numbers are in the report, by the way. Okay, so we're sort of nearing the end of the presentation. So basically just sort of, if we move on to the slide 19, that's the summary slide. And that really just is summing up what we've discussed. So the kind of key points from the work that we've done is that, there's the collection costs are going to be sort of between, depending on what your scenario is, between $45 and $110 roughly, depending on what level of service you choose. The low-cost scenario is obviously the lowest cost one. As you move up in cost, you also move up in recovery. So you get more benefit, not necessarily in direct proportion to the cost, but reasonably sort of tracks reasonably similarly. If you want to get the max carbon benefit, then the max carbon reduction scenario is the one that's going to give you that. And that's mainly because you're choosing in that scenario to send it to an anaerobic digestion plant as opposed to a composting plant, which is more expensive, particularly on the transport side of things. That's because you've got to send it to Reparoa. So there's a kind of cost factor there. And then just on the last slide, that's essentially slide 20, that's essentially the same as the previous one, but we've just added in that 68% gas capture assumption at landfill as opposed to the 89% in the previous slide.
Duncan, Roger, have you got another question? You're on mute, I think.
Yeah, I'm happy to wait until the end of the presentation, but I do have a question.
We can only just see the top of your forehead.
I'm trying to work two
No, you're gone.
computers here.
Good heavens, you must be on a trampoline. Far out. Easy, easy.
There you go.
Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, well, that's pretty much it as far as the numbers go. So happy to take questions from this point. From here, just the next step is to finalize those numbers. We've just got a little bit more work to do on that, and then issue the final report, essentially. But yeah, open to questions and feedback.
Go for it, Roger.
Right, thank you, Graham. Yeah, really, really interesting. And I realize that at some point in time, we need to go down this track. So it's not a question of whether or not we do or don't. I believe we do need to go down. But this is a question possibly more of Ken in going back to slide 7, where we had all of the total costs to the district of the service. Ken, when we looked at the options of increasing levels of service to the LTP, we had a dollar figure of overall cost that would contribute to a 1%
Roger,
increase?
Roger, Ken's not in the room, not on Zoom.
Oh, is there any? Oh, is he on Zoom?
No, not in this meeting. He will be in here later on, but no, not here.
Oh, there's nobody that could answer.
Nobody
finance
that could,
questions.
no, there's not at the moment.
Can anybody around the table remember what it was in terms of?
I think it's about 200,000. Yeah.
Thank you. That's right. So the low cost, the 600, that would result in a 3% increase in rates. Would that be
Not-
about right?
Not
Yeah,
sure of
good.
the exact figure there.
No, through the chair, I thought every 600 and something thousand was a percent, wasn't it? And it was 67,000 was 0.1 or something. Gary brought that to us during the LCP.
Yeah,
So, yeah, I'm pretty sure 600 odd is around 1%, is what Gary said.
Right. So 1%, 1.3, nearly 2% for the maximum carbon, and possibly nearly 3% increase for the high diversion. Yeah, okay. Just gives an indication in my mind of what kind of implication on rates we're going to have. I'd like to have some further indication of that if we can get those figures from Ken. Yep. Thanks.
Sorry, through the chair,
Dawn.
I guess it's also recognising that of course that wouldn't be applied to all households, so it would only be
Yep.
applied to the urban households. So whether we also maybe have a look in terms of actual implications to the average urban.
thank you, Phil. Sorry. No,
Yep, thank you. Just a quick clarification on page 12, cost per service. Is that with or without this? Oh, that's per, oh, sorry. No, forget it. I was asking whether, sorry.
It's all right.
It was with or without the subsidy, but
Yep.
don't worry. Yep. You've already bought, the government's hopefully already given us.
We did ask the question about, and in our submission, we asked for support from central government for operational costs, but they seem to be indicating that it's not something they'll be considering.
thanks.
You know, if they do fund the bins and the vehicles, that's a huge cost. You know, it's massive.
Yep.
That's a big one-off cost.
Yeah, and the way that we have
Or starting
calculated it, we've calculated what that would be if those costs were sort of flowed through to the operational cost. So it takes the cost off the annual cost effectively.
It's huge.
Hazel, did you have a question, please?
Yeah. Yes, I do have a question. And I really want to start by saying I absolutely applaud the approach that we've taken, and that we're actually dealing with climate change, that we're dealing with all the problems that go with it. But could you just give me the figure, please? I've listened to all this, and I'm working without my laptop beside me with your report in it, but I will go back and because it's something's happened to it. What did you end up with, the actual figures that or estimated figures that it was going to cost every urban household when you get the plan going? And just in plain language, please.
Yeah, we have those, Hazel. So Duncan can just give you those.
Yep, sure. So that for everyone else, that's essentially on slide 9 has that information. So we're saying for the low cost options around about $46 per household, for the all round option 52, for the carbon reduction scenario about 83, and for the high diversion around about 100, 110.
Is that per year?
Per annum, yep.
Per year.
So ranging from $46 to $110 per household, Hazel.
Yeah, and then there would be some council costs on top of that. So that's not including communications and enforcement and contract management costs, which would add maybe some other $5 to $10 on top of that.
Thank you.
What my concern, what's behind this question is that you know, there's our lower income people, our pensioners, and our people who, for what other reasons, are struggling terribly at the moment. What I was trying to check out, oh, here's the district nurse. What I was trying to check out was, you know, when we're putting more costs on people who can't afford the living that they're doing now, and yet I'm weighing that up against the fact that we're giving clean air and we're dealing with pollution. So, yeah. So what you're telling me then is that it's really insignificant. If it works out to little more than $1.
Yeah, Hazel, it's Sally
so
here.
a week.
Yeah, when you look at your PowerPoint slide 12, on 11, we get into cost per service. So the lowest cost one is 88 cents a week. So if you think about how much, if they use one rubbish bag a week and they can spread that to one rubbish bag for every 2 weeks, they'll be saving $2 from the rubbish costs alone.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. I think that's well within that's an acceptable amount into your lower income people who are struggling to even put food on the table at the moment. So thank you very much. And I really again thank you for all the work that you've put into the end product, which is cleaning up the atmosphere. Thank you.
Thanks, Hazel. Lou has a question.
Sorry, just to add to that.
Okay.
So what Sally said is absolutely correct. So the although there is the cost of the service, householders will be able to reduce their costs if they actually recycle their food waste, put their food waste out. You get rid of the smelly stuff. When you get rid of the smelly stuff, you don't need to put your bag or your bin out nearly so often. And so you can actually reduce the frequency of your and the amount of bags or bins that you use and reduce your overall costs more than you actually add to your cost.
Yeah, we know most of our householders use prepaid bags and most of them only put out one bag a week, but about a third of that weight of the bag, 33 to 36% is food waste. So once that's out, it is feasible. They could maybe stretch to 2 weeks for a bag, and where I've got a food waste service and I know Claire does hers composting and I've got a worm farm. So mostly my rubbish bin never stinks, and I've got 2 dogs and they never get into it because there's no food in there. So and mine's just mostly single use wrapping and packaging. So there's definitely that benefit. And with the cost of curbside, no doubt going up with the increasing levy, we can expect our companies to continue to pass those costs down. I think currently the prepaid bags between $4 and $4.50 for 60 litres. So if they can stretch that to 2 weeks, that's a good $2 savings right there. So yeah.
I must say I was selfishly looking at it too, because no food waste, not absolutely one scrap of food waste goes into my rubbish tin. And I know that there are other people like me who all of our scraps go into our garden, into our compost heap, and we use it to grow our own food.
Lou, your turn. Thanks, Hazel.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to mention a couple of things that came to mind straight away. I see that you're transporting all of this food waste over to Tokoroa Way.
Yep.
Our council has actually voted for Minoak to actually take the compost out of our current system of waste that we're getting from our wastewater system to a system that they're building a lot closer than Tokoroa.
Yeah, and Matamata.
In Matamata. So I'm sort of indicating that maybe we could look at that being operated there. The second thing was that although you've got Reparoa, once again, Reparoa is a long way away, and anything that involves transportation is going to have incremental costs and increased costs. And when we talk of electric vehicles, okay, they don't use fossil fuels, but they will have user charges on them, just like diesel engines. They're already predicting this at the moment. So every mile will cost a dial, so you're going to have to pay for those along the road. So what I'm saying is that if we can compact that, it's good. But the final thing I'd like to just mention to everyone too is, of course, all of this goes on to our rates. It doesn't go to the general consumer. Everyone, ratepayers are not the whole population.
No, I agree.
And this is something that'll depend on our. We've got to consider this in doing this. So a lot of ordinary people out there that are renters also, or living in rental and part accommodation, won't be paying this. So it's got to be considered when we're looking at the whole exercise. Okay.
Yep. No, great. Thank you. And so just to say, actually, in the modelling, we did take into account the Matter facility. So that yeah. So the other thing around, and you make a good point about the transport and the logistics. It is a big extra cost. And we did in the report, we do sort of look at the possibility of a local processing option. That's something that would need a lot more work to figure out the feasibility of it. But from our initial sort of look at, it, the advantages of a large processing facility is you get a lower cost per tonne, there's lower capital costs and the economies of scale essentially. So you couldn't compete on the gate rate at those facilities with a local facility, but because you've got bulking and transport costs, when you add those in, you're probably getting pretty close to what those costs are likely to be if you had a local facility. Depends a bit on the type of facility. So if you wouldn't be able to build an anaerobic digestion plant and have that be economical, because that's a much higher capital cost item. But you could potentially build an in-vessel type composting facility somewhere, Te Awamutu, Cambridge, somewhere like that, that would potentially be able to take that material. And that would avoid those bulking and transport costs. You'd probably come out, I would say, somewhere in similar. The disadvantages of that type of approach is that you have to. There's probably some risk involved in commissioning the plant, and if the council's going to commission it, you probably want to get an operator to come in and build it and run it for you. And there's some risk around that kind of thing, and then they need markets for those products that they're going to produce. Whereas the existing operators largely got those markets set up and developed. So,
Susan's question, please.
Yeah, hey, look, I'm really enjoying this discussion. I sort of wanted to echo Graham's concerns about contamination. I think we all realise we've really struggled in terms of our yellow bins, and it's escalated quite significantly since COVID lockdown. So that's something that looms quite large in my mind. And I guess probably additional to that, and even before we even look at contamination issues, to me the key for this whole thing being successful is the messaging and communication around it. I mean, there's so much misinformation around rubbish anyway. I mean, how many emails and abusive letters do we get from people saying, council hasn't picked up my rubbish? I mean, it's quite rubbish. But it's going to be a hard sell, and I think we have to be really, really clever about how we educate our communities and take them along that kind of journey, because it's an area that's just fraught with negativity at the outset, I think. So it's a way of I think the big thing is try and sell it as all the boxes it ticks and all the positives it can bring. Because I think there's a little bit of an uphill battle before you even start. But look, I'm all for it. I think it's exciting, and I'm looking forward to seeing what we come out with at the end of the day. But just a couple little words of warning there.
Yeah, thank you for that. And but I do note in the last LTP, we got quite a few, why aren't you doing what Hamilton's doing? We did get quite a few of those, and they were unsolicited because we didn't ask anything about food waste. So, but yeah, like you say, any service change, as we know, you get a lot of pushback. But yeah, I think, communication is definitely the key when you're getting into that rollout phase.
Yeah, and I'd echo that. I mean, I think it's still a pretty new thing for most people in New Zealand, the idea of a food waste collection, and the perception is like, well, that's going to be smelly and stink and gross. And so there is probably an initial reaction against separating out your food waste from a lot of householders. So there's some challenges definitely around getting householders to sort of buy in and participate. That's why we tend to sort of push people towards those the line sort of caddy systems that sort of have less of the yuck factor. But the other big one that you mentioned is contamination. It's probably worth having a bit of a conversation around that. So that is probably, I would say, the single biggest challenge in terms of getting that service sustainable. If you at the end of the day, what you collect, you need to have a reasonable, a good quality product that will have a market, not just like another form of landfill, and if there's contamination in there, too much contamination, then that will compromise the quality of the product, and that will cause problems down the track. So the education is obviously one of the keys to contamination, to controlling contamination. The other thing is being able to monitor and do compliance around what people are actually putting out their bins. The problem is if you have an unlined bin, no one wants to go through that bin, and and it can be pretty gross, especially if people leave it sitting around for a week or two. And so the collectors won't want to do inspections or any of those sort of things. And the biggest problem that you have generally with contamination is people putting stuff in plastic bags.
And not taking it out of the packaging.
Yeah. That can be a problem. So the operators will usually run a contamination line at the facility to sort of pick out any gross contamination, any plastics and stuff. But the ideal is that you reduce that contamination before it kind of gets there. And again, what they do in the best performing systems in Europe is if you've got those compostable liners, you can check the bin and make sure there's nothing else in the bin. There's only what's in the liner, and there's no plastic, no non-compostable plastic in that bin. And so there can be a little bit of curbside sort of monitoring and checking as you go, which can reduce the contamination.
Because it is a manual lift.
Yeah,
it is a manual lift, so they have that chance. And just to add to that, the government is also consulting on standardising what items can go into a food waste collection nationwide, similar to exactly what they're trying to do with plastics, which would be great. So then we would benefit from any future national standards around that. That'll be very clear. What you put in your food waste in Auckland is the same as here, is the same as New Plymouth. Also, they're working on compostable stickers for fruit labels and stuff. So they're all compostable instead of being plastic. And they're also, one other thing around contamination is because the bin is smaller, you can't put in a lump of concrete and stuff, which is, the crazy stuff we're getting through our recycling because their bin is big. So you do limit your damage kind of thing. So pretty much because the bin is pretty narrow, it's that big. So, they could put some stuff in there, but they're not going to be able to put in like a car battery and stuff, that kind of stuff, because it is smaller and the handle isn't that strong. They won't So there's that, but I do understand that. But I think a couple of those national level things, standardizing what can go in, would be helpful communication messages, because it'll be the same everywhere.
Can we just stop there? His Worship's got a question. He's been.
So a couple of quick ones. In terms of the Reparoa facility, and this is, we're only one of many councils, is there some capacity limitation on Reparoa? We don't want to start a collection service and then them say, oh, sorry, we can't take your rubbish anymore. You've got to find somewhere else for it to go. So that's the first one. And what are we doing, or how can we make the system encourage people to actually reduce the amount of green waste, not green waste, household waste, I should say, because effectively that's the problem, isn't it? If you provide a service like this, possibly even twice a week, there's no incentive for people to actually reduce the amount of waste that's going to that composting system.
Yeah, so both good questions. So the first one just on Reparoa. Reparoa is a 75,000 tonne per annum capacity facility. They're not at that yet in terms of the committed tonnes to that, as I understand it. You're talking about 1,000 to 2,000 tonnes, so that's sort of not much in the scheme of things. They're also talking about potentially adding capacity to that facility as well. So I think as far as Reparoa goes, that's probably not likely to be a problem. Again, you'd have to go to market and go through that process to be certain, but I think certainly with the tonnage you're talking about, they would accommodate that fairly comfortably. Sorry, then your the roast. So the other thing with that, what you actually find, and there's some statistical evidence for this overseas, but it's a little bit hard to pin down exactly. But what seems to happen is that when you ask people to separate out their food waste, they actually then see how much they're wasting, and then they then they actually go, oh my goodness, why am I chucking all that stuff out? And they actually make some adjustments to their behavior and don't actually generate as much food waste. So what actually happens with you, if you look at what's in the rubbish at the moment, in terms of food waste, and then you put a collection system in place, food waste kind of disappears a little bit. You got some left in the rubbish, you got some that you're collecting, but there's a bit missing, and there's a little bit
Increased
of
consciousness.
yeah.
Because Mayor Jim and Lou came to our audit and we pulled out all the food waste. So you saw a lot of that stuff. And, you know, at the moment, people just throwing it right in their rubbish bin. They're never actually seeing it on there, like in a caddy or, you know, and so they're probably a little bit naive and unaware. So Love Food Hate Waste did some surveying, and they asked people, do you think you're a low food waster or a high food waster? And people had apps. There was no correlation between what they thought they were and how much they actually put out. So they can't say whether they think they're like wasting less than a kg a week. They actually had no perception of it. So yeah, like Duncan's saying, once you give them the caddy and we ask them to like separate the food waste, a lot of them will go, oh God, kids can have that muesli bar again. It's not even open. You know, the stuff we saw that could definitely have been eaten. So you hope that will go down, and we want this service to be for food scraps only. So it's not, we will keep working on the food waste and reducing, you know, encouraging them to shop to a list and plan your meals, and, you know, trying to keep working at the top part of that hierarchy and reducing the amount of food waste people have. And hopefully this could be for food scraps. So we're not seeing the whole avocado, we're just seeing the pip and the skin. That's our goal. We don't want to give people the easy out, like, oh, it's okay, just throw it all in there. You know, I totally see your point on that. And we'll keep driving hard on our reduction messaging.
Sally, how much is that words on that packet best before date? Because when we saw that photo, you had unopened packets, and I'm going, why couldn't you have put that in your freezer?
Good question.
And I know I don't want to be, I've got young people in my family, but once that best before date comes, it has to.
So that is a challenge, but we have done that education.
It's got a lot of leeway, honestly, you know.
Yeah. So best before is a guideline, and you should still use your senses, but use by is more food safety. So best before is a guidance. It's best before this date, but it's still safe and edible after that date. But you have to use your own senses and judgment, but use by. But again, that is part of the education. And I would imagine if we decide to do a food waste service and we decide to do it in this year, we'd spend the year before that, again, reminding people, hey, this is how you reduce your food waste. This is how you can eat the food you do have and all that kind of stuff. But what we're already doing, but
Marcus, and then Mike.
I'm pretty positive about it. I think this will be a great service. I think that there'll be less contamination across all the recycling things, because people should know that the food waste goes in the food waste container and not in the yellow bin. But then again, people. But what about things like bones and eggshells and compostable packaging and all that stuff?
Not compostable packaging. So again, that's
going to be that will be the problem.
Yes.
Because the compostable packaging, like it says on the packets, packaging is compostable. And so I would assume that, hey, I'm just going to chuck it in my.
Okay. And that would be very, very clear in all the communication. And that is kind of where that work that the government's doing is they are at this stage indicating that compostable packaging will be out. And the main reason is that compostable packaging doesn't add nutrients to the compost, and composters do not want it in there. And a lot of it isn't that compostable. So, but that's where we would just follow the, you know, the standardization of what everyone else is doing. But at this stage, they had compostable packaging out, but bones, eggshells, pips, anything that, in. Yeah, but I can share that list. Maybe I'll add that to the report, the proposed list.
But things are like, so maybe not the compostable packaging, but if I've got something wrapped up in a piece of paper or in a tissue, a paper towel, can the towel go in?
Yeah, food contaminated paper towels and tissues and stuff, okay. But wipes, you know, because wipes isn't actually breakdownable. Yeah.
Michael.
Thank you, Graham. A couple of things. One is I've done some quick numbers, and if you're 30 to 40% of rubbish is food waste, I'd like to know the data. I've just done it on one bag per household per week, like one yellow rubbish bag. I don't know if that's accurate or not. It's acrid-ish in our house, we probably use a little bit more. But that would, at 30% of that bag being full, if you could put that into the system, you'd save $60 a year on saved bags. And at 40% it would be 70, but even at 30%, $60 covers the first two scenarios. So of that then would become an education thing of actually, this is going to save you money, not cost you rates. And of course, the tenants, as Lou's alluded to, who don't pay rates, if the landlord doesn't put the rent up, then they're actually going to save some money, which would probably please Councillor Vance. Genuinely. The other thing is this, is on page 3, that kitchen caddy under the all-round scenario. Now you talked about it, it's sort of like a closed shell. We've got one at home though, and the vents are on top. So, and hey, it does get manky, don't get me wrong. We feed it to, stuff to the chooks, it does have to be clean, but it can go a couple of days without smell. So could that be considered as that kitchen caddy rather than a closed thing, a bit of a hybrid? Is that worth looking at?
Yep.
So you'll see, Mike, on the next slide, that the other two are vented, but they're vented on the sides. But I think that's where they have the bigger surface area. And then, because then you can retain the lid as whole, where you can print on guidance and education. So we kind of want to keep the lid. But yeah, we're not suggesting that people would keep this kitchen caddy there for the whole week. The idea is you fill that up, tie it up after a couple of days when it's full, because it's only small, chuck it in your outside bin, got another couple of days for the end of the week, tie that in. So it's not, if people are very low food waste generators, they could have it there for the whole week. But you know yourself, a few days, and then put it outside with the more lockable and a bit of distance from the big bin.
Look, I understand that, with the difference of 753,000 to 1.2 million is significant. So I'm just saying I know it is a bit of a hybrid scenario, but if you can keep it in there with no liner for a couple of days, put it into your big bin, it sort of achieves the same thing, apart from how you deal with it at the end. There's a different process, I understand, but
that's certainly something you could look at. There's going to be pros and cons with that. I mean, you're still going to get a lot of mess in the bins. The bins cells will kind of get manky and smell and require a bit of washing out. So that can kind of put householders off. Also, the collectors, there's the collectors and the trucks. That's more of an issue for them. So there's certainly look at all those options. I think it's worth mentioning as well. We've looked at a bunch of scenarios. When you go to market, you can say this is our preferred system, but we want to hear from you, the industry. How would you like to do it? And you can get them to price a bunch of different options on which you can then go away and decide exactly what you want.
And just to clarify, Duncan, so I thought the bag price that was in there was just for the small little container. Is it for the small container and the big 25 litre?
The bin, the collection container. Yeah.
Oh, so
the caddy.
So it only lines the caddy though?
Yeah.
So the collection person at the truck doesn't really care how it gets in.
Yeah, they do, because if when you imagine you fill up your caddy, you quickly tie it, you put it in your big green bin. So when the guy comes for the big green bin, he'll just tip out 2 or 3 or 4 bags, or 2 bags or 1 bag. But if it's not contained, they get a lot of splashback.
Yeah,
that's the problem for the handler of the bin. So they do prefer it to be tied.
One more question. This is the last one, please. Hang on. Clear now, please, Hazel.
Oh yeah. So I'm coming from a slightly different angle, because I already have no food waste going in my yellow rubbish bag, so I'm not going to make any savings. And I also compost all of my food waste. I just feel that this system is actually penalising people who are doing the right thing already. And so I just see my rates are going to go up substantially, and I'm really not going to get any benefit. I do live in a rural village where there's a lot of space on our section, so it is possible to do your own composting and looking after your food waste on site, I guess. And I've already mentioned to Sally, is there a chance to maybe get a bit more information on the practices of people in different parts of the district, whether or not there is, you said to get more information. I mean, my angle is, could some people be excluded from the service or opt out? I know that you're not keen on that, but even though the costs there, I suppose they look reasonable on a per collection basis, but as I said, I don't need the collection at all. I feel that the contamination and compliance issues are likely to add to the costs quite a lot. It'd be good if you could do some modelling on that actually, because like with our recycling, the contamination has added, I think it's close to 10 or even might be getting to 20%. And we need to be realistic that we won't be able to avoid the contamination. We were going to get some details on how Hamilton's implementation of the food collection system was going to go. I don't know if you've ever received a substantial report on it. I think we just got, because it'd be good to know how they are dealing with some of these issues too. Like generally, I mean, I am in support of reducing, the emissions from waste and that, but I'm just putting my perspective on that.
Yeah, so Hamilton is still relatively new, and then they've had a couple of lockdowns, which threw people off, and because it's hand collected, they couldn't collect it during lockdown because of contamination risks. So they haven't had the most perfect start, but I could definitely get some more detailed data. But some of the data that Duncan pulled through into the modelling was about their set out rates and stuff like that. So I can definitely get a more up to date,
or even a different example of an implementation. Doesn't necessarily be Hamilton.
Yeah,
but
or New Plymouth is the other one.
Yeah.
So
and I'm also quite keen on having a local facility rather than trucking it off. Yeah, I can appreciate that it might be more challenging. You know, over in Europe, I've heard about farmers that actually have their own digesters because they're also encouraged to generate their own electricity. And I don't know if there's an opportunity to actually have a collaboration with some large farms or something where, you know, we'd provide, a lot of feedstock for them for these kind of operations, and that it may be, so it's not just looking at urban areas going, you know, to Reparoa or Tokoroa, but we'll actually look at a couple of ones in the district that are a larger scale, but they actually support our farming community as well, who are wanting to get into energy generation too. Like I've heard that they grow maize crops specifically to feed the digester, but their overall economics for the other stuff they do on their farm, it comes out, it's a benefit for them. So I don't know if you've sort of looked at that scenario.
Not specifically, but it is something that you could do. It's something that would need a bit of work to figure out the feasibility of it for sure. Just on the other question around the people not using the service, because ideally everyone would have a compost bin and no one would put that's the perfect scenario in lots of ways. But the reality is that there's even for people who do home compost, there's things that they can't, like bones and shells and pineapple tops and those kinds of things. When we've looked at that, there's inevitably home composting not going to work for everyone. So you need something that's going to sort of fill that gap, as it were. Appreciate that there are going to be people who are doing the right thing, and like you say, that sort of might seem like they're getting penalised. The only solution I've sort of come across for that kind of thing is something they do in Italy, where they have like an official home composting scheme. If you sign up for that official home composting scheme, you go through their course or whatever, then you get the tick, and then you can get exempt from the collection fee. So there's some options that you could look at if that was something that you were particularly
Duncan, we need to bring this. Yeah, we do need to wrap up. Hazel, do you have a burning question, please?
Just very quickly.
Yes.
So have we got the right to say I don't want a bin? I can imagine. I know our senior citizens and others who live in little. They've got no room around they've got no grounds around their houses, and on these tiny little sections that they're building on, there isn't any. They've already got 2 big bins. Now they're going to add a third. So, but can those of us that don't want to use that bin because I'm all mine's going into the ground here and I've got the room. Have you got the right to say, I don't want a bin here? Thank you.
Hazel, we'll just get Sally to cover that. Thank you.
I think those are discussions and things that would need to
Yep.
be had once you decide to have a service and we engage in a contract, because that's more of a rates-based question and
Yep.
not really for us, but that's something that
Oh,
will
right.
be more
Okay.
around this table and the rates team to decide.
Right.
Okay, and that's all from us, and we'll be sending out a full report, so you'll be able to read all the detailed information, and any further questions, we can get them via email.
Okay, thank you. Lou, did you have a burning, the final question? No?
What's not a question, just a company support. Claire.
Okay, then I'll close it down.
That's it. So just support Claire. All I say is I've got 800 squares in a large house and we've got 3 compost bins and they work exceptionally well.
Thank
We
you.
don't have any waste. And by the way, to break down bones, very easy. Just get an old incinerator, run everything through it and it comes out perfectly. And
Thank
it
you.
goes through the waste quite well.
Unfortunately, though, most people aren't going to make an incinerator bone compressor, but everything's possible. But
I think, well, yeah.
for most
Hey,
people.
Hey, thank you very much for your succinct